Hello, and thank you for joining us for our third and final session of Unmasking Racism in Anti-Racism Education, Youth Ministry with the Reverend Dr. Gia Starr Brown. Thank you so much for being with us for this series. I hope that you have found it as informative as I have. I want to just remind everyone to check out the Yale Youth Ministry Institute website for upcoming events in November, as well as a wealth of resources. And I know we've got a lot more to cover in our final session here today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the Reverend Dr. Starr Brown.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you and am really grateful that you have prioritized this conversation today. Thank you for being here with me and with us. We're going to dig right in. I think that what Kelly shared is definitely, let me go ahead and move here to our view here. There we go. What Kelly shared is really encouraging for me to hear. I'm so glad that this has been that this information, this conversation has been meaningful for her, and I hope that it has also been meaningful for you. If you are joining us, live and in person, welcome. And if you are catching this recording at another time, thank you so much for creating time for this space. We have been on quite a journey in the past couple of sessions. So let's talk about how we're going to spend our time together today as we wrap up this conversation. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to recap on our education models, because education is cumulative. So we're building, we're going to recap on those models. And then we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this. We're going to talk about curating anti-racism curriculum components and facilitating anti-racism curriculum components this morning. And then we're going to tie things up with checks and balances and some practices that can be used just to kind of for places and spaces of accountability. And just to remain engaged. And then after that, we'll have some time for your questions, for Q&A and for conversation before we close. So just as we did in the last session as well, if you have questions or thoughts, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm super grateful for the leadership of Kelly and Megan, who are also online, to help facilitate those questions. And so when the time comes, we'll be able to dig in there too. So please utilize the chat. I may not see it as much, but they will see it, and we'll be able to lean on that in a few moments. So let's dig in. We're just kind of recapping some of these education models and where we've come from. And one of the first things is important to do, I always do, is I go back to the basics, to the beginning, the foundation of definitions. Remember, I am a word person. I'm a language nerd, and I love language. And so here are the definitions. Here's a definition of racism, and now we're adding this definition of anti-racism to this conversation and to our lens. So racism is the prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, by a community, or by an institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized. This is Oxford Dictionary's definition. And I always say that there are definitely time and space and temptation to have a discussion about racism beyond those who I would identify as minority or marginalized. But because this conversation is centering around that experience, we're going to stay in that realm. Anti-racism, the definition, in contrast, is the policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial equality. So here's a policy. So it can be a policy, it can be a rule, or the practice, which means practice makes perfect, our activity of opposing racism. What I love about this, again, here's my language stuff, is this here, look at these words, ing and ing, opposing and promoting. That means it is constant, it's ongoing, and it's current. Right. And so just to kind of look at the difference between, between here and here, we're talking about this ongoing work. And I love that. So practice, yes, and praxis, where learning meets practice, right? This is where we want to be. So I want to kind of lift this up, that our focus then, if you see this, is not only, ensuring or working toward having policies that are in our learning spaces surrounding anti-racism, which is critical, it is paramount, but also we're talking about now the actual practice of opposing racism and promoting racial equality. Right? So I want to kind of lift that up as we're thinking about what is our responsibility in this discussion. Here it is right here. Oxford's letting us know. So when we talked last week, I introduced a couple of models. It's just a kind of table that I created over the years, looking at traditional learning models, and then also looking at its counterpart, engaged pedagogy. So we were looking and we talked about what traditional learning methods have looked like and what they've been inspired by, usually by what we see as the white, cis, heteronormative individual, and practices that tend to support white supremacy culture, which present an image of what the standard of learning and education should be, and also what the ideal of success should be. And so then this is the image that has been presented in traditional spaces for students to learn. And learning traditionally has been one way and one directional, where the teacher, the person in the front, who usually traditionally embodies those characteristics that I just talked about of leadership, but also then students then are receptors, are receiving the information. So kind of receptacles of information that is being deposited into their psyche, into their brain. And then the testing then, consequently, the testing tends to be focused on how much of that information has been retained, if I can regurgitate the information. So, when we're looking at traditional learning models, we're recognizing that there is little to no room for student contribution, and for that to be considered as education or as integral to the learning process. Engaged pedagogy, on the other hand, talks about the fact that both students and teachers are students and teachers, and that experience does carry authority, that experience does bring some wisdom into the learning space, and the learning space doesn't have to be limited to a four-walled space, but that learning, our classroom, is actually the world. And we talk about multiple teaching strategies. So now we're not just focusing on that one person in the front that's telling us what they know and us being tested, but actually there are other teaching strategies and other learning strategies that are incorporated into this space as well. It's intersectional. And authentic voices carry wisdom. We are not so much focused in engaged pedagogy on people being comfortable. We're more focused on telling the truth and on being transparent and demonstrating, modeling that transparency and truthfulness is what love looks like. Right. And so because of that, then look at this bottom piece on the right down here. Culture and oppression then are considered in teaching methodologies. So if we're talking about a particular topic, we can always find ways to integrate the experience, the expression, and the oppression of people who do not have the voice to or the agency to be able to defend and voice themselves. So this is kind of where we left off last week, was looking at the realities of where we have been and where we're going and what some of these characteristics might be. We also talked about the fact that if we're looking into anti-racism curriculum, then we need to look at a holistic type of a curriculum. Holistic being defined as relating to or concerned with wholes, with whole complete systems, rather than with the analysis of or the treatment of or the dissection into parts. So we're talking about, even some of these identities. So for using myself as an example, I identify, I'm African American, I'm a woman, and I also am queer. And so it's challenging walking into a space and having to pick one, right? Or have one be picked for me of the identity that I will lead with and that I will that I will assume when I'm walking into that space. So typically when we're talking about, for example, one of the challenges with our current trends for anti-racism conversations is we stay particularly in the space of race as we're talking about, the skin color color and oppression of people who are in a particular marginalized race. But typically what happens with that is we tend to turn a blind eye, or we may not be, that's not, I want to change that because I don't want to use blind eye, right? I want to change that because that also is an ableist response. We tend to turn away from opportunities to discuss gendered racism, to discuss, the levels of intersectionality, the fact that I am a woman and the fact that I am Black, and what that combination means for me and my expression of life, right? So when we're thinking about holistic, we're talking about the fact that we're not only speaking to the fact that I am African American, but we also need to be speaking to the fact that I am a woman and that I am queer. So holistic is allowing people to step into a space that is that where all elements of their identity are embraced and received. Okay, are embraced and received. And one of the things that I lifted up, and you'll see down here, is I show this kind of picture of a mirror, and I'll lean into this in just a moment. But the importance of seeing ourselves, in the curriculum and in its implementation, in its representation, that it's important for us to be able to see ourselves, and for people that are coming into our learning spaces, for them to see themselves in these different spaces and modalities as well. That's really important to do. All right, so now we're going to turn into curation, and we're going to dig into this because I think that this is important as well as we're talking about, all right, how do we, now that we've recapped, how do we turn toward curating this type of curriculum? Now that we have some sort of a general idea, how do we go about pulling some of these things together? And the reason why I say that is because being, anti-racism curriculum is not something that you may particularly find as easily accessible at your local bookstore, right? Or online, because traditionally, anti-racism curriculum does not exist traditionally. Curriculum may exist, but anti-racism curriculum may not. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start with the fact that we may have to curate some of this. Curate means we may have to gather some pieces, we may have to supplement, we may have to do some of these pieces, because in our country, in our nation, some of our most progressive institutions lean into a space that is also known as minimization. Minimization is one of the orientations as part of the intercultural development inventory, the IDI, that assesses people's level of intercultural competence. And so in that, there's a discussion about this mindset of minimization where we just kind of assume that everyone's like us. And so we just kind of, right, take our beliefs and our mindsets, and we just kind of assume that whatever we feel is the same that everyone else is feeling. And we kind of put this out there in large masses with this assumption. And it comes oftentimes from a very well-intentioned space of wanting to say, if we treat every single person the same, then we can ensure that everyone is treated well, is the hope, the intention, and we can keep all of the quote unquote bad stuff out. But because we're focusing on minimization and kind of a generalized type of an umbrella, then even keeping out those differences, we keep out the beauty of those differences as well. Why is this important? Because we find this in curriculum, where our curriculum tends to be generalized and it tends to be widespread, and presented as objective for every student, for students that are learning from that tool, from that resource. But if we're talking about something where we're being specific about curriculum being anti-racist in nature and in content, if something like that, it may not exist, because that is beyond the most progressive space of our learning platforms in our nation traditionally. And so because of that, we need to be prepared to put on some of our work gloves, right? We're going to have to build our own road, and we're going to have to supplement and curate some other pieces that's going to be a part of this process that I think we should be prepared for, is that there is additional work. Because if it was easy to be anti-racist and to teach anti-racism, I believe that we would have done it a long time ago, don't you? So let's look at this model. So this model is very similar to other models I found on websites like the Semantic Scholar, and also in other learning higher ed institutions that are looking at the components of curriculum development. And what I liked about this, what I chose about this model, this one actually is a 6-step approach, and it comes from Johns Hopkins University. And so it actually is this model here, this image is also used for medical education, which is very interesting. So I see this model across the gamut as we're talking about learning spaces, because we're not necessarily talking about the content, right? We're talking about the components. And so the components are saying here, we're looking at one of the important things is, I'll just start here, is that it's important to have goals and objectives for the learning. What are we hopeful for as we're bringing this material, these resources to the student body? For our youth, what are we hopeful for? So curriculum should have goals and objectives. It should have those. It should also have some educational strategies. There should be a variety. And I love that this is plural, that there are multiple strategies that are employed as we are bringing this information over to the learning body. We're also looking at the fact that, look up here, too, that there is also, and I'm bouncing around intentionally, look at this, there's problem identification, general needs assessment. So looking at, the students and what are the needs in the classroom, and assessing where the entire classroom is as a whole, but then also individually, where each individual student is as well. And this is important. And I think sometimes this is what gets missed in our educational spaces. We tend not to provide more intentional and in-depth targeted assessments unless there's some sort of a quote unquote problem that we feel needs to be solved or addressed. And so we see that sometimes there are additional assessments in learning spaces if we're concerned about behavior or development. And likewise, that is important to ensure that those assessments take place. But additionally, each individual child should also have some sort of an assessment of their needs. And I'll talk about what I mean by assessment in a moment. Right. But this is important just to name that there is an overarching, and there's a corporate, and there's also an individual piece that's here. And then look, there's also the implementation, and there is an evaluation. How did this work? Did this work? And who's evaluating these pieces? And so as we're looking at curriculum, especially looking at CYF, sometimes some of these components, we miss some of these components. We may have 45 minutes, we may have an hour on a Sunday morning. Sometimes we may have time during the week, an hour and a half with our kiddos, right? And so we may not have as much time to provide in-depth assessments and needs. I'm aware that there are times when our leadership that are in CYF may not have an idea about how to even locate or facilitate these assessments. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But what I want to be able just to lift up here is that there are components to curriculum that are important to have. The goals and objectives keep us connected to the purpose and the goal of what we're trying to impart to students. And it's important to ensure then, what I love about this, about the general and the targeted, is that when we're evaluating, then there's accountability structures that are put into place. Which oftentimes we tend to miss in ministry spaces. We tend to not put a lot of emphasis on evaluation, on evaluating the program and the model and the implementation. And this is so important for us to do, because a huge part of learning happens in the church. Right. And so what I like about this is this model, and I love that, look, it's almost like a web where each one informs the other. Right? So implementation, look, targeted needs informs implementation. The problem identification, the general needs informs this. Look, it informs the strategies. Our goals and objectives inform, look how they all inform each other, that they're all integral to the system. And this is important because remember, when we're going back up to holistic, we're talking about an entire picture. right? So we have a responsibility as educators to look at the entire person versus just one specific focus. And so this is important for us to see and to kind of recognize where we're starting from, and what we have. So let's move on from here as we're moving into culturally responsive teaching. HMH is a website, and they have a company. They're an adaptive learning company. And one of the things how they discuss teaching is they say that all teaching should be culturally responsive. And here's a definition. Culturally responsive teaching depends on a learning environment that affirms our students and helps them feel included, validated, valued, and safe. Now, what's interesting about this? Included, validated, valued, and safe. Now, these are words that may be presented objectively, meaning that there's an absolute term. As long as we, in our minds, this is what minimization does, right? Kind of minimization assumes that how I experience the world is how the world is experienced. And I wouldn't know any different if I didn't have relationship with other people that could help to widen my lens. So through this minimization lens, oftentimes we look at what makes us feel included, what makes us feel validated, how do we feel valued, and what does safety mean to us? And then we create the framework and the environment based on our lens. But listen, here I am. Here's my language piece here, right? Here's my word nerd. Helps them. Oops, let's go back up. Helps them feel included, validated, valued, and safe. How would we even know if they feel included, validated, valued, and safe? We would know here through this evaluation. And how would someone feel comfortable? If someone would feel comfortable sharing these things is if relationship is there. If the relationship has been cultivated and prioritized, then students would feel comfortable sharing the truth and their reality about how they're experiencing the learning space and the content that's being presented to them, because there wouldn't be fear of isolation or retribution or punishment or shame. They would already have that would have already been established by the time evaluation happens, right? So I know I'm dropping a lot of information because it's super important. And so look at this. Now we're talking about this. So in order for us to know how they feel included, validated, valued, and safe means that we've got to create an environment, and we've got to set the tone and the culture. Culture is the way that we do life together. We've got to set the culture in our learning spaces for them to share these things, because they're our success of this curriculum, then look at this, is contingent on their experience of it. Their experience of it, not our experience of facilitating, not our experience of cultivating, but it's based on their experiences. Very important. The following elements are crucial. As facilitators, a fundamental belief in the ability of all students to learn. A fundamental belief in the ability of all students to learn. If you have ever sat in on a course or a class with me, then you know that themes I carry throughout, and we go on a journey. And so one of the things I noticed, another reason why I wanted to bring in this curriculum development for medical education, is because we know that historically, especially in our country, a lot of the medical journals as recent as 1997 were communicating that some students of color, particularly Black students, and Black individuals were different than their counterparts and their white-bodied counterparts, that they did not have the ability, one, to feel pain, and to the same level, but also to learn, that learning styles and learning abilities were different. This was one of the arguments for the reasons for the perpetuation of slavery. Right, of the marginalization of peoples, is to say, well, listen, they don't learn the same, they don't listen the same, they don't grow the same. There's a different belief about their humanity and their ability to engage in the society that we are creating. And so culturally responsive teaching, then, you can see then that up until this point, even as recent as less than 30 years ago, our physicians that are still practicing today were being taught from a curriculum that was not culturally responsive. And we have to name that. right? We have to own that. So we're wanting to do something different. Do you see that? We're looking to do something different. So there must be a fundamental belief by those who are facilitating in the ability of all students to learn. There must be a wide range of curricular content. Look at that. So there's no more, here's the one and done deal, but there must be a wide range. And it reminds me, as someone who has been in education for 30 years, I started as an early childhood educator. And one of the things that I talked about were just about the developmental ranges of kids in certain classrooms, and how we definitely may have a baseline, but we've got to make sure that we have, right, a variety of experiences and activities and modifications that meet students where they are. This is no different. So we should have a wide range of curricular content that's here. There must be dynamic instruction, right? So dynamic, right? So we are coming and meeting people where they are. We're open-minded. We're engaging in conversations that invite imagination and invite exploration. There is an excitement in this work and in this learning. And also community involvement. Look, they're saying that community must be involved. Now, I love the reason why I bring this up is because these four elements are four elements that I rarely see in CYF ministry, right? That I rarely see in curriculum models and in development, which is why I started writing it, was because these are things I rarely see. What I see is we see scripts, or we kind of see step-by-step spaces, and here is the activity. But in terms of equipping students with curriculum and with content that meets them where they're at, there must be a wide range of curricular content. And as I'm moving forward in this, now we're just talking about curating, but also then that means that if there's a wide range of content, there must be a wide range of facilitation, right? There must be a wide range of implementation. Not everybody then learns and retains information in the same way. So I'm just dropping these seeds as we're moving through these slides, because this is important. This is important for us to see that community involvement is important for culturally responsive teaching. This is important, that's here. All right, so let's keep going, because I'm going to add to this list. So let's look at this list that I started to create about anti-racism curriculum content. So some things to think about. And these are not things, I mean, I don't want you to feel like you've got to hurry up and scribble and write these down. One is because I'll make the slides available. And two, I'm more interested in your processing of the information. As you're I want you to just in your mind, think about the curriculum that you're already using or that your congregation is using. And let's kind of go through these. So one says that the first thing I say is that anti-racist curriculum should be open. That means there should be opportunities for questions and curiosity and exploration, open-minded and open-hearted, and leaving room for those, for that exploration to happen. Sometimes we go in and we just, here's the scripture, here's the activity, we're going to do the thing, here are the questions. But really, learning is exploration. Which is, I think about, sometimes people will attach this to the idea of learning through play, right? Of learning through play, and how important it is for self-discovery to be able to have room to explore and to open and close and peer through. Think about that early childhood education. The same thing comes from this. As we're opening up scripture and we're looking, we should be able to create room for questions and curiosities and, and for imagination to happen. So it is not closed, it's open, and it must be relevant. And what I mean by relevant, meaning that it must somehow point to what is happening in the world, in the community, in the nation today. It must involve an opportunity for us to apply what we're learning with what we're doing and where we're going today. That's important. Praxis, life application. So it must be relevant. It's really hard for me to focus. And we talk about it. You think about this. I have kids, and whether or not you have kids, if you are engaged in youth ministry, I'm sure you've heard this before. But I've heard from my own kids that are, in the middle of their high school math classes, and they come home and, they give me that familiar expression and say, when are we ever going to use this? We're never going to use that geometry. We're never going to, and this, are we going to use this? And even some of the the studies that have come out about how many adults are actually working in fields that they got their degrees in. Right? I mean, so the idea of relevance is really important. Where not just from your lens as, or from our lens as educators, but also from youth, where they would believe and feel, oh, okay, I can tie, this makes sense. I'm learning this here, and I can see how this here can apply to this here. And sometimes there needs help, and we need to provide opportunity and help to bridge that, but it must be relevant for them. It must be relevant. Otherwise, how are we applying scripture if we can't ensure that we can not only that it expands beyond Sunday morning? It must be contextual. And what I say about that is that we also must ensure that our contexts are different. Context is a place, it's a space, right? Just your context is your setting. And so it must involve your setting. There must be some opportunity to engage, right? So if you're in a faith community that is you see sometimes there's like youth worship, and there's right, and there's youth choir, and there's other opportunities for youth to get involved. There must be opportunities for youth to witness and practice what they're learning in their context. It must be inclusive in terms of language, images, process. When I think about inclusive, I know that becomes such a what I call a buzzword. It's so overused that you start to lose its meaning. What I mean by that is we have to ensure that everybody that is coming into this space, everybody that is a student in this space, feels as if they are included, seen, felt included in the curriculum experience. If there are language barriers, then that should be addressed. Again, and I'm going to hammer on this as we're moving forward today. So you'll see this again, but they should be able to see themselves. Representation of who they are and how they express themselves should also be in the curriculum. Otherwise, we say, is it relevant to me? Is this curriculum relevant to me? A lot of times people of color, I think about this too, about this idea sometimes, and I think about Black History Month and how there's so many faith communities that will say, well, we don't really acknowledge or celebrate because we are a fully white-bodied congregation. And so because of that, it seems like it's not needed. We don't need to address some of these areas if we don't have people that are in our context. But remember that it isn't just about spreading the gospel. Means that we are going, if you are a follower of Jesus, it means that you are spreading this gospel and that you are taking it with you. And it means then that you have to, that we must believe what we are sharing. We're carrying this. And if I'm going to believe what I'm sharing, then how I'm learning it, I must be able to see myself in the curriculum and in the process as well. It's got to make sense to me. It's got to make sense to me completely. I think about, for example, I think about my own children being in as they were growing up. They're older now, but as they were growing up, and we would be in faith spaces that would be the white majority spaces, and all of the images of scripture, of Bible story, of people journeying, all the images were people who are white. And that was a challenge for my children, who said, does that mean that we're not a part of the body of Christ? Does that mean that we go to a different heaven? These are all questions that they were asking about salvation, about eternal life, and they couldn't find themselves. And so image is really important for our youth, as well as the process for how we're learning. It must be multifaceted, which means that not only are we bringing activities to kids and to youth to be able to do, but they must be able to experience the curriculum and experience activities. I don't just want to read about bubbles. I want to blow bubbles, and I want to reach for the bubbles. And you know what? I also want to learn how to make bubbles too. Now we've got science, and we've got math, and we've got self-discovery, and I want to learn about that. And I want to learn about how solutions can be these bubble solutions can be used. And now, for example, there are tons of stories, just to give you an example of some young people who saw bubbles and came up with an idea for a balloon that is helping with climate change out of playing with bubbles. And so even the multifaceted, you can see how even bringing bubbles can be an activity, but all these other layers at here invite us into an opportunity to really pick up something and examine it from all sides. It must be transparent and truthful. If we must be honest about some things. Sometimes we want to soften some conversations, or we stay away from some conversations. But let me tell you, as we turn on the news right now, and I mentioned this, I think last week, our young people have access to the news in record time now, right? In like seconds, they can see the news, and they can hear updates about what's happening around the world. And so coming into a space where we're talking about spreading the gospel, but not discussing what's happening in our world may seem a little bit off kilter for some people. It's important for us to be honest about scripture and about the hard parts of scripture, and also to be truthful about how it has been used, both positively and also as a weapon. We must be honest about these things so that we can fully equip our young people to stand in the gaps and to also continue to spread the gospel. Right? It must be interactive and relational. Anti-racism curriculum, again, we're talking about the fact that relationship is key. Relationship is key. If we're stepping away from minimization, where we're kind of taking this on, and minimization says we don't need relationship because we're all the same under the hood. And so that couldn't be further from the truth, which we know. And so interactive, building relationship is important for me to be able to apply the concepts I'm learning, not just to my world, but to my friends' world, and to that other small group's world. And I've got to make sense of this. This is how empathy and relationship are built, as well as not just turning my focus outward, but also turning my focus inward, introspective. I also should be turning in to look and reflecting on how I'm connecting with this curriculum and what it means for me, and how I am implementing these aspects and these tools that we're learning, how I'm using those as well. It should be introspective, inviting reflection. I always add intergenerational and community centered, because I feel like those are pieces that also tend to be missed, where we kind of assume that certain age groups don't have much to offer other age groups. And CYF, I'm a big proponent of intergenerational learning and wisdom and storytelling, and a lot of times even having intergenerational spaces. Imagine what happens when people who are I'm a Gen Xer. So imagine what happens when we pull together, when I myself as a Gen Xer am next to one of my children who's Gen Zer, and I'm trying to figure out how to do something on my computer, or I'm trying to figure this out. And I'm Gen X, where I joke, but it's so serious. I still am a big fan of Word 2007 as the best, right? The best processing system ever. And what happens when I'm in a space with teens and with young people that are using Google Docs and other spaces? I learn from them. I learn about process and protocol and systems and language. I engage with them. And what happens also adversely when someone who is older is with someone who's younger, there's wisdom, there's direction, there's guidance that happens there too. There's beautiful things that happen. And so anti-racist curriculum should involve these elements as well in terms of being culturally responsive. So let's continue this. Bell Hooks, in her book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. So she says that education is freedom. Look at this. She says, any radical pedagogy must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged. Everyone. That's not only teachers, that's not only students, right? Everyone's presence is acknowledged. That insistence cannot be simply stated. It has to be demonstrated through pedagogical practices. To begin, the professor must genuinely value everyone's presence. So as we're pulling this together and we're looking into curriculum and content, and you're in your mind scanning through curriculum that you're using or that you've used, we're looking at some of these elements that are here. Now, I'm saying, as I've said before, here's our muscle. We may have to do some heavy lifting because curriculum, as what I'm describing to you, is not always readily available. It does involve having to kind of supplement and pull some pieces together. But look at this. It has to be demonstrated. It has to be modeled. You have to believe what you're teaching. Right? So, and I say that, I say that down here, and I'll come back up to this first one, but let's look at this. I say this: anti-racism embodied must be embodied before anti-racism is shared. Right? It's something I say all the time. So if you feel free to share that and just give me a credit shout out there, right? Because it's so true. Anti-racism, in order for me to actually teach it, I must believe it. I must believe it. I must wholeheartedly believe it. Same as the gospel, right? If I'm going to share the gospel, I must believe it. Kids, youth, young people are so in tune. They're great judges of character. If you don't believe what you're teaching, they're going to know, right? Just like we know. And so you must embody this. So even this, so as I'm talking about this is, so we must embody, we must be open. Our conversations with young people must be relevant. We must be inclusive. We must be transparent. We must embody these characteristics, right? That I'm talking about. So we must embody them first. I have to believe that every person has a right to be seen and to learn and to be heard. I must believe that every person has something to share, because if I believe that, then I'm going to look for that. It's, if I'm believing it, it's a part. If I embody it, it's a part of me. So just like we look at a plate of food and we look for, remember the 5 food groups? I think now, again, I'm a Gen Xer. I think now there's 6 or 7, right? But 5 food groups. And I remember being in school looking at my plate and having to check, is my protein here? Right? Are my fats here? Are my pieces here? So the same thing is happening here. Is like, we can't share anti-racism. We can't share these elements and certain elements if we ourselves are not looking to ensure that we are feeding ourselves the nutrients that are necessary for this work. Because once I'm doing, it becomes a muscle that I'm using all the time. I'm automatically scanning the room and looking for images that need to be changed. I'm automatically considering authors and tools and resources that are diverse and diversified. I'm automatically considering the different environments that kids are coming from as they're coming into these spaces, and all the obstacles that they may have had to encounter to get there. So anti-racism must be embodied before it's shared. And I'll go back up now, right? And you say, here it is, relationship is key. I mean, I've got to be able to have relationship. I've got to be able to be, focusing on relationship in order to be able, I've got to prioritize that. And where does learning happen? Well, learning happens anywhere, or this type of curriculum content happens anywhere that learning happens. You can gather curriculum anywhere that learning happens. For example, and I shared this a bit last week, and I'm going to give this, and I'll kind of expand a little bit on this too, is even considering the fact that that here we are. Sometimes when we think about learning, we go to our libraries, great places of learning. We think about books that we have read, and we as educators, if we're adults, we typically tend to employ the same tools that were employed, that were utilized for us for our learning experience. So I'm from the hardcover Encyclopedia Britannica. So I don't have Encyclopedia Britannicas here, but I definitely am interested, right? I'm used to that type of research. And so research is key for me. So just to know and be mindful that the way that you have been taught is usually the way you contribute to the way that you teach. That's important to know and be mindful of. Keep it right here. But also any place where learning happens. So if I'm interested in anti-racism curriculum, I would really love to go, where does learning happen? Learning happens on the park. Learning happens on the playground. Learning happens in other faith communities. Learning happens in other neighborhoods. Learning happens at the grocery store, right? Anywhere where you can learn. is where learning happens and curriculum can be curated. So if you, for example, imagine with me what it could look like as you're thinking about your own CYF curriculum to go to a synagogue and cultivate relationships with their youth ministry, to sit in on some of their events and to watch and witness how Hebrew may be taught through some of those classes, how engagement is happening, learning about some of those tools, and could help you in adopting some of those tools and some of those processes into your own space, right? What you're going to see, for example, is in some spaces in underrepresented communities, there is learning and preparation that is folded in to the curriculum. I'm going to give you an example. I have a grandson. He is the cutest grandson in the world. I'm sure you would say the same thing about your own. And there is on YouTube, there is a musical. He loves. His name is Kai. Call him Kai Kai. And Kai loves Gracie's Corner. Gracie's Corner is they have all types of preschool and elementary musical selections and videos that are out. But what they do is they take traditional music and they add to that. And so, for example, their Itsy Bitsy Spider Climbed Up the Water Spout is really great. And you see Gracie, and Gracie's African American, her family's African American. She's got friends of different ethnic backgrounds that are also there, and they're in different spaces. But one of the things she says is, here's the Itsy Bitsy Spider. And then she goes off in this other riff and she says, keep climbing, keep climbing. The sun's going to shine again. Like, this is part of her song. Keep climbing, where we're already, and this is happening. So creating preschool videos and music, here we are, that are, in mirrors, so I can see myself or Kai can see himself, is important. And also recognizing that Kai is African American as well. And as he grows, he's going to encounter a lot of setbacks because we live in a society that is riddled with racism. And so giving him even some of these little pieces, the sons keep climbing, keep going, is giving him some of these pieces, that he can add to keep going, right? So that, even that, is anti-racism in full effect. And so what I'm saying is, like, learning can happen anywhere. If you're going to a synagogue or you're tuning into other cultures, how are other underrepresented cultures and communities, how are they teaching their youth? How are they teaching their people? What's happening? How is teaching happening in different cultural cooking classes and and different learning spaces? How are gymnasts learning about learning their steps in gymnastics classes? I mean, just to go and explore and to see how learning happens can widen our facilitation, because we're able then to model some of these tools after what we've seen and what we've witnessed. And why is this important? Because we don't just create curriculum for the students that are here right now. We create curriculum for the students that are yet to come, for the community that we hope to have. We create curriculum and we implement it for the demographic that's here, for the here and the not yet. And so we must ensure we are creating curriculum for the people we're hoping to pour into, for the future leaders that we're hoping to tap into right now, for their formation today. And so, you turn on the news right now, and you can see tons of people that are on the news that clearly have not been introduced to anti-racism curriculum content, right? And so there's a shift that's here. You can also go, looking at curating anti-racism content, going to organizations intersectionally, organizations that share in the same visions and or beliefs. We in ministry are so great at, like, creating siloed ministry. We just will create more food shelves and more ministries and more things on our own. I remember I was the founder of a nonprofit organization about, oh my goodness, about 10 years ago. It's been about 10 years. And we were creating a food shelf for the families that we were supporting. And I discovered that there was another church that was kitty corner, literally kitty corner, across the street from us, that also had a food shelf. And I walked over and I thought, hey, we should be doing something together. There's no reason for us to be doing something separately, right? We should be coming together because so that we are not one spending money on duplication of services, but also we're cultivating relationships. And we don't all have to be, people. And I say this intersectional because here are organizations, maybe some organizations that you partner with may not be have the same philosophical or denominational beliefs as you, but they may share in your belief that everyone deserves to have enough food on their table. And that's a great connection to have. Doesn't mean that we have to agree on all points, but we can agree on that point. And then I wonder what type of curriculum content, what type of curriculum they have about their food and about growing. Can I go to farmers, even though I'm living in an urban area where there are no gardens? I can go to farmers and talk with them and learn from them and integrate some of these visions for healthy eating there. There are ways where we can supplement and integrate curriculum that allows us, here we are again, I don't want to make you dizzy, but allows us to go, here's this holistic element here of what we're learning. So yes, you may have to create some pieces, expect to innovate and supplement. You should expect that. You should expect that what we're getting, what you were sharing may not be fully what you and the students that you are teaching need. We should expect that because again, minimization is kind of the general rule. So this is so it's important for us to look at this, right? And I saw this image that I thought was really interesting. Here's that mirrors and windows. It says we read, and this is about reading. I'm an author. I found this quote and I thought it was so powerful. We read to see two kinds of worlds, our own and the ones we can't imagine. We read to see ourselves reflected and to peek into other people's lives. Our kids need to read about people not like them to expand their horizons and their empathy. Their horizons and their empathy. So this came from a quote. Thalia KR is from a website where they're talking about the importance of diversity in materials, in reading materials, right? And that is so important, but also this is important for what we're talking about today. We look at this, the ones they can't even imagine. And it builds not only their horizons, but their empathy, because empathy is what we need. Empathy is a key component of anti-racism curriculum, of anti-racism methodologies, is empathy. We must be able to somehow connect and relate to each other. And if we can't even imagine what that looks like, we're at a loss, aren't we? So look at this. One of the things I say here as we're looking into facilitation now, and I move them together, I merge them together for this reason, is that anti-racism curriculum, is the educational arena where the content, its curation, and its facilitation are one and the same. So what I mean by that, what I'm teaching, how I'm gathering what I'm teaching, what I'm teaching, and how I'm teaching should be all the same. Should be all the same, right? So let me give you an example. Me talking about going to synagogues or going to different spaces, right? Me going there to a synagogue or going to a space to be able to curate the content. Going there, that activity is mirrored in me going there in content and is mirrored in me going there in facilitation. I am actually, by going to the synagogue and sitting in this space, I'm actually a student before I'm a teacher, right? And so I am learning what it is that I'm going to teach. So then my students can learn what they're going to teach. You see how this goes, these ripple effects. So anti-racism curriculum, if I'm talking about intergenerational, the content should be intergenerational. The way that I'm getting it, I should be looking at intergenerational ways of getting the curriculum, right? As well as I should be considering who are my facilitators and are they intergenerational as well? You see how that all goes? Where it is in every layer. There are methodologies and implementation that mirror the focus of anti-racism. So first is that mirrors and windows of representation, right? It should be trauma informed. The curriculum should be trauma informed because people who are coming from marginalized and minoritized populations, if you are cast out to the margins, that's trauma. So that means that the curriculum should be trauma informed. That means that we should be trauma informed. We should be aware about these types of traumas. We should be taking classes or taking studies on what types of trauma we might see in classrooms so that we can recognize that and pivot if we need to. We should be anticipatory. We should be sensitive of obstacles, kind of building off of this trauma, being trauma informed. We should be aware of the obstacles. I mentioned this before. People coming into classes. I remember sometimes you think about this. I've heard people say, it's really hard to teach hungry children. Because if they're hungry, they can't focus on eating, right? And so, so many times, some of these obstacles, the reality is that people who are cast out to the margins don't have access to the same tools and resources and relationships and connections that people that are in the center of society do. And so imagine, even if you think about it in your mind, think about a city and think about the suburbs. Think about how hard it would be to get to the city from the suburbs if there wasn't, right? If there wasn't a commuter train or a bus or wherever you are, if that wasn't there. Think about how hard it would be to get there. You'd have to, maybe you'd want to Uber, but then you'd have to have the money to Uber. So now you've got to figure out the money in order to get the Uber to get to the place, right? And so I'm saying this because these types of obstacles, people who are cast out to the margins tend to have to navigate a lot. And so we must then be aware and anticipate that. We must have an extra granola bar, right? We must be ready to see if somebody needs a ride to church or a ride home, that we're able to, that we already have built that into the system. We must anticipate that there's going to be challenges here, because that is how relationships and trust is cultivated. Curriculum that is anti-racist in nature should also be solutions driven. So we should be focusing. We should be truthful and transparent about the problems that we see, and we should be turning and pointing towards scripture and towards our community for solutions. We should be focusing on solutions being driven, not just presenting, this is the way that it is, as the majority of curriculum goes, but let's also work a muscle that invites critical thinking. How can we improve the conditions that we see right now? How can we do that? What does that look like? And how can we have these real conversations if we don't have trust? So relationship is key to anti-racist curriculum. I've got to be able to trust you to tell you that I haven't eaten today, or that I'm concerned about what's on the walls. I've got to be able to trust you to say that I need a ride or that I need something that's here. Prioritizing relationship and connection is key to anti-racist curriculum. There should also be, you should also be incorporating underrepresented cultural ways of communication and learning. So I say, for example, for me, I give an example even of turning on my TV and I put on my closed caption or my subtitles. I do that now. A lot of people do that now. Whether or not someone is there, putting that, having that there, going into an event and having someone who is signing in ASL, not only if someone is physically there, but also because we want to be able to model and demonstrate that we're thinking, that we're inclusive, that we're mindful, that we're prepared for people that recognize and need other forms of communication, that we're equipped with those tools. Right? Because then what happens is someone who recognizes that and may not need ASL, for example, may tell their neighbor who does. And oh my goodness, their neighbor will say, oh my goodness, they've already done. How great is that? And they may tell other people. Next thing you know, you've got tons of people who are there because of this. I think about that, whether it's the Spanish language or even the example I gave about Black History Month, and the reality that oftentimes we employ a white supremacy culture. We employ these models. The white supremacy culture, has indoctrinated us in the ways that we are bringing information to our communities even. So we assume, for example, Black History Month we need someone who's African American to lead that in. I oftentimes tell people, this is how I know that progress is being made is in a white majority space when a white person is bringing in, is celebrating, is honoring, is naming Black History Month, right? Because it doesn't necessarily, we don't need the token to be able, a token image to be able to model this. We've got to be able to widen the ways that we're communicating, and to share that. And I also put on here, again, what I shared about exploring underrepresented communities and curricula. We've got to be able to do that. Like how are African American, how are Black churches teaching their young people? What does that look like? And how can we bring some of these modalities into where we are? Additionally, looking again at places with intersections like those orgs I talked about. Not only am I thinking about the sharing of resources and curriculum, but my goodness, imagine what could happen if you had cultivated relationship. Then we could go to these other spaces and say, would you mind taking a look at this curriculum lesson and telling me if this makes sense? I want to introduce this to my kiddos, and I'm not sure whether or not I'm really on the mark with that. So even in relationship, right, then we can even be going and asking for feedback about what we're bringing and what we're sharing. Not cold calling asking for that feedback, but if we're in relationship with our neighbors and with our cultural neighbors, then they would be more than willing, because they know our heart, to share and to give that feedback about, well, you should probably add this other piece. This, it probably would sound, really great if you added some intergenerational elements to that. You want to talk about the civil rights movement? That's really, really great. But you know what? Wouldn't it be great to have some people that were there? Right? So even having other lenses, and this is why this is so important, targeted and general, integrating a myriad of approaches. Some people, I have PowerPoints, and I know, I'm so glad that Zoom is now enabled closed captioning, right? Because some people want to have subtitle closed captioned on some of these, on even on this talk, on this presentation. We should ensure that not only are you hearing my voice, but you're able to see these things, and that we're able to integrate other approaches so that it is inclusive. And there should also be experiential elements to this. We want to ensure that people are able to take what we've got and practice it someplace. Yeah, I can learn about farmers and how things grow, but you know what? I want to actually bring the soil and a seed and a milk carton, and I want to be able to do that, and I want to grow something and then make a salad with it. And now we have all of these pieces, and now I have room to talk about what happens when people in certain communities don't have soil. What happens when gardens aren't in certain communities? I live in Minnesota, and Minneapolis, right in the Twin Cities. North Minneapolis was a space that was targeted for redlining, and they were also known for a long time as a food desert, where there was literally like one grocery store and only one way in and one way out of that space. So imagine what can happen when we're kind of bringing in some of these spaces. Now we can talk about, as we're making our salads, we can talk about the economy, and we can talk about prices and people who can't afford it and what do they do. Now we can talk about some things, because the world is our classroom now. And we're not limited to what's inside of a book. We should expect that we're going to have to supplement and innovate some things. And sometimes a checklist, can be helpful. Sometimes we can have a checklist. So let's talk about now some checks and balances that are here. So one of the things I really appreciate is panning. It is an acronym for pay attention now. You may have seen this before. They liken it to how a movie camera, kind of pans the entire space so you can see that. That they liken it to that by saying that sometimes, we are just like this. And so we just tell the story from our own lens. But what they're talking about in panning here, you can see at the bottom that this comes from the Center for Transformation and Change, is widening our scope and beginning to pan, to consider the specific details and facts. Look at this, details and facts, not assumptions, of what you see, feel, and hear. Describing what you pan without any assumptions or interpretations, conclusions, or prejudgments. Now that's a muscle that we need to work on, right? That's exercise for sure. This idea, this practice of widening things, noticing the group memberships of people involved as you pan, describing the group memberships if this information is useful, intentionally observe and notice behaviors, comments, feelings, patterns of treatment. Beginning to wonder, is this an isolated incident or a possible pattern of experience? So this is talking about, becoming aware of what you see and what you notice, not your bias. And you see, I'm talking about biases, right? We're wanting to widen this. So one of the ways, checks and balances, we're talking about accountability, is for you to begin, it's for all of us to begin to widen and to begin to pan, to learn how to pan. Here's another thing another tool that I found that I think is really important. This comes out of UCLA. It's called Reimagining Migration. And I love this. I love this. Is culturally responsive pedagogy incorporated into my teaching? They've created a checklist for us to follow to begin to see this. And I thought it was so great that I wanted to bring this in. So they have levels. There are 4 levels. So look at this. And this is a checklist. Look, level 0 here. No culturally or linguistically relevant materials were included in my class. I know. So now let's move to level 1. Let's look at level 1, right? Look at this right off the top. Heroes, holidays, historical events, discrete cultural elements are incorporated into class lessons. Linguistically, here's a checklist, code switching to establish rapport as needed to facilitate understanding, including major figures. We can talk about what code switching is if you need to. You can put that in the chat. I'm happy to expand on that. I don't want to spend time on that if we all know what we're talking about. But if you need it, put it into a question in the chat. Including major figures, contributors, historical events, including cultural or artistic works, literature, music, visual performing arts, and artists from cultures other than the dominant culture into the lesson. This is level 1. Including research contributions from cultures other than the dominant culture into my lessons. That's level 1. There are 4 levels. So let's look at this. Look at level 2. Multicultural content, concepts, and themes are incorporated to the lesson from multicultural students' perspective. So now here's that engaged pedagogy where students are also teachers, where their experience is wisdom. Look at this. They're incorporated into this. This doesn't mean that without relationship, I pick on the one person of color in the room and ask them to share, right? That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is through relationship, as folks are feeling comfortable, then they are invited, they are open, they feel welcome to share from their own experience if they would like to supplement what's already there, not to be the lesson, to supplement the lesson. I include resources and texts, reading, film, look at this, that present multicultural perspectives in the lesson. I include lectures and discussions that present multicultural perspectives into the lessons. I teach a unit that presents multicultural perspectives into the curriculum. That's level 2. Level 3. The structure of the curriculum enables students to view concepts, issues, events, and themes from the perspectives of diverse ethnic, racial, and cultural groups. This is level 3. Look, transformation approach. Do you see where we are? Look, this one here is contributions approach. There's no approach. Contributions approach, look, additive approach, transformation approach. Now we're getting into a space where we're hoping to see transformation. Do you see where this is going? Providing resources and instruction that enable students to view concepts, issues, and themes and problems from several multicultural perspectives. Providing resources that enable students to view concepts being studied from multiple perspectives, right? Analyzing what I'm talking about, infusing multiple perspectives, frames of references, content from various groups and perspectives of understanding of nature, of development. So not only, right? So I tell people this all the time, Black folks don't only want to talk about injustice. Black people golf, Black people sleep, right? Black people eat. But usually when we're talking, sometimes we limit people of color to the obstacles, the oppressional obstacles that they are trying to overcome. And there's so much more than that. So look at this. So weaving in nature, development, and complexity of society, including the canons of my discipline, and augment them to reflect the complex synthesis and interaction of the diverse racial, ethnic, religious, cultural elements that comprise our society. This is level 3. Let's look at level 4, where we're going, where we're hopeful for. Look at this, a social action approach. Now we're moving into action. Do you see this? Students make decisions on important social issues and take action to solve them. Look at your, and these are checklists for us as educators. My teaching encourages students to identify existing social problems or issues from multicultural perspectives. The lessons and assignments encourage students to gather pertinent data from multicultural perspectives. So now you're not going to the same space. We're talking about gathering data. Where you're going to get it has to be different. Encouraging, look at this, encouraging students to clarify their values and make decisions about existing social problems using multicultural perspectives. So clarifying their values. So this isn't about us, this is about them. Teaching encourages students to take reflective actions to help resolve social problems, part of this level 4 checklist. And I see this, I found this, one of my, I am a big keeper of quotes, and this one here caught me. Few are guilty in this conversation. Sometimes we say that, but all are responsible. Everyone is responsible for where we are, how we've gotten here, and how we go where we're trying to go to. Another piece of this is, you know, as I teach, I consider, do I view my students through a deficit lens? Do I recognize the assets they bring? Am I already assuming when they're walking through the door, some students are coming at a deficit? How do I talk about students' identities? How do I speak about the histories and cultures of groups other than my own? Are members' histories and cultures of the non-dominant group characterized and represented? I'm going to add and celebrated through a deficit lens, like are represented, right? And celebrated. Or are we looking at them through a deficit lens or with demeaning messages by me? Or through the resources I use. Because it doesn't mean that even if I'm not the one, remember we talked about perpetuating, even if you didn't write the curriculum, if you are participating in this perpetuation of the ideals that contrast an anti-racist society, then we are part of the problem. And I love this image at the bottom that shows, look at this, that we've seen this before, equality, where everybody, look at this, here's equality, everybody has the same box, but everybody has the same access. And here's equity that shows that we're going to make sure those that need it, those that have it. But look at liberation, removing the fence altogether, removing the obstacle altogether. And I love this. I love this idea and kind of where we are. And so these checklists, these pieces we're talking about creating anti-racist curriculum. I'm going to stop sharing for a second because in a moment, I'm going to invite your questions. But one of the things I say is I know that what I'm asking for and what I'm presenting, I know that it's a lot. It is a lot. It's overwhelming. It's so much. And you know what else I say? People of color are required to remember, to pan, to equip, to hold, all of these things. If they can do it, if we can do it, everyone can do it. That's one thing I just want to name, is that there's an expectation that I have to be mindful. I have to be aware of what's happening in the space because I'm not carrying the power. So I have to be able to notice this. So I just want to name that. But then the other piece I want to name is that we're all doing this. We're works in progress. And so for us to be teachers, I'm going to take us back to, in order for us to be teachers, we must first be students. We must embody and believe what we're teaching in order to teach it to other people. We must do that. We must do that. Time for your questions. We've got about, 15, 16 minutes. I had a goal of 12, 10. I'm doing pretty good. So what thoughts do you have? What questions do you have about what I've shared either today or even over the past couple of weeks if things have grown for you? What's happening in your mind and in your heart?
Yes, feel free to drop those questions either in the chat or the Q&A. We'll keep a watch on both of them. But I have a question. And understanding that people on this call are coming from different contexts and different places in their journeys with this, but I've been thinking about the fact that in certain contexts, middle school or high school youth group in particular, typically don't have a curriculum that's as formal as even Sunday school or church school, right? So if I'm a youth worker and maybe even somebody who works a full-time job someplace else, and still does this work for my church because I'm passionate about youth formation, what kind of expectations should I set for myself and my congregation, right? The people who are depending on me to do this work about what the process of curating looks like. I mean, I'm not going to solve, this isn't happening overnight, right?
Yeah.
So instead of feeling overwhelmed by what's in front of me, how should I be thinking about how to approach this curation and this work?
I love this question for a variety of reasons. One of them is because it eliminates our tendency to gaslight the work and to gaslight the struggle, right? We say, oh yeah, we could just flip this light switch and we're no longer be racist, right? Like, and this is kind of, we put on our button that says that, we did the thing and like everything is great. And the reality is like, it's not. This is a lot of hard work. And in any curriculum that you see, in any curriculum model that's used, it doesn't have to be anti-racist, right? Like, so if you think about your middle school, like a middle school math curriculum, somebody spent years, right, putting all of this work in and compiling and exploring and trusting to pull something like that together. So, in terms of managing our own expectations about ourselves, recognizing that it takes a really long time to curate materials and resources. And so for me, I think it's important for us to be able to have some stepping stones, which is why I really like that reimagining migration, that checklist, which I will, I'm going to I'll send the PDF so you can send it out of that tool, because it kind of widens some of those things and helps us along, because we don't know what we don't know. Right. So I think a first piece is managing expectations. This is such a big conversation that even I like it can feel like I'm throwing a cup of water in a forest fire. It's hard to even like, am I making a difference? Am I like, like, how do I even know? And so having some indicators, some ideas, and those goals and objectives are really important, to be able to say, you know what, I really want to be able to have a goal where we um, are really focusing on cultivating relationship together. And right. And like, and so even beginning to start even small with some of these ways, even adding some of these ways, one thing at a time, bringing someone in intergenerational, right? Even just beginning to this small little one-offs. So some of these pieces are really great to be able to begin to build, because we're building. It's white supremacy culture that says to us, right, this idea that we have to have everything finished and polished and flashy and fancy before we present it. So many times ministry in other areas of the church becomes stagnant. Like, think about, like, because we want it to be perfect before we bring it to the community. That our well intentions, our heart, we want it to be great. We want it to be awesome. But people will say, but I'm hungry today. I can't wait for 3 months for you to like make sure that you have all of these. Yes, do that work of like having a variety of dietary needs and all of this. Yes, do that. But also, people are hungry today. Is there something that can be done today? So I say that because it is that sense of urgency and that sense of perfection are characteristics of white supremacy culture. And those are things that tend to get us hung up, where we want everything to be great. Starting small, taking one particular piece and adding it in like this would be really, really great from some of the examples I had. Maybe recognizing, my goodness, for example, I'm looking at that chart and I'm saying, I'm at level 0 right now. And what am I going to do? Maybe I'm looking at my goal for the quarter is to incorporate one element of level 1, right? In this next quarter. How can I do that and get that woven in? And then I'll look at another element. And we're building, because as we grow, as we know better, we do better. But to wait until we're finished, it can be a challenge, because I feel like I'm going to say what I say as a pastor when I say like a sermon is never finished. Curriculum is never finished, is it? Like, it's never. There's always something more to teach and something more to say and something more to share. And so it's a work in progress. And if you think of curriculum in that way, right, then we can offer ourselves the grace that we receive. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that. I don't see any questions in either right now. One thing I wanted to put out there is, Gia, if you have resources that you've created, we would love to be able to share information about those in the email that goes out to folks this week. So, please let us know. We'd love to continue to support the work that you're doing. Um,
Thank
right.
you. Yes, yes, absolutely. I have, so I'm a qualified administrator of the IDI, which is the Intercultural Development Inventory. You can find some of this information on my website, which is just my name, giastarrbrown.com. I've designed an anti-racist curriculum that integrates 24 educators, BIPOC educators, to share their stories using a variety of different platforms, and youth can actually be involved in that project. And it actually starts later on this month. And so if you're interested in that, you could connect with that. Right behind me is one of my curriculum books. I think I'm trying to point right. It's called Remind Me Again. There's another one which is called Unearthing Us. I've written curriculum. And so I write CYF curriculum with us through a social justice lens. This one, these curriculum facilitator guides, written based upon the poetry of Joe Davis, who is a spoken word African-American spoken word artist who's here in the Twin Cities. And so he's published a couple of books of his works, and I've taken those. And so these are through Augsburg Fortress, and have taken the poetry and have created lesson plans through with some of these models. So those are there as well for you to be able to pull and to grab from that. I'll send the Harvard, I'm not the Harvard, the UCLA piece as well, so that there's kind of a checklist to be able to look at. And there are tons of resources as well that I'll share from that work, but also from other works as well, just to kind of give you a starting point. The reality is that we're all learning how to do this together. And and as culture and life and climate changes, curriculum changes too. And so, that may be published, but I bet you if I go back in there, I probably want to add a few more lessons to it, because it never finishes. It never finishes, and it's never going to be perfect. And there's always something more that we can do. But the point is that we're trying. The point is that we're trying and we're making an effort. And whether it's one simple thing or 8 simple things, or 8 things that we're doing, an inch is still progress. And it's more than where we were an inch ago. Right. So I say this to people all the time. And so if I can be of service, I know that I'm working on a couple of CYF, some social justice confirmation curriculum right now through a couple of denominations. So those things are present too. And so if you those are pieces that you may see coming as well. Okay. Oh, I see one question here. Let's see, maybe before we close, talk about how to help students develop empathy. I think that's a great question. Empathy is, you think about what happens when you get online, and you look at data, right? So data collection, I'm thinking like Pew Research, for example, right? So they're just kind of collecting numbers, collecting data. And it is important data that we see, but data is like data, right? Like it's like, it doesn't mean, like, oftentimes we see data as those are about people that we don't know because we don't have any names or any information. And they're numbers that are here. And there is an element of distance, that's there, where it's like, yes, them, but yes, I'm aware of a problem about unhoused people. Yes, I'm aware about whatever, but like, that's data, that's numbers. And there's a distance from me and those numbers. When we put faces to the data, then we're able to say it's not just that person. Oh, it's my next door neighbor who needs where this vote matters. It's actually my child's classmate who is a part of this issue that's happening, and it really matters to them. When we can put faces to the data, when we can build relationships, right, with people. So when I'm talking about, then there's empathy. because now I care about this bill being passed, because it isn't just about the people I don't know and the numbers over here. It's about my friend Susie. It's about my classmate that's here. And so now I can connect with that because there's relationship that's here, and I have empathy for how they experience the issue or the concern because I care about them. When you care about people, then you come to care about what they care about. And so then empathy is established. But you've got to be able to connect people so we can care about it. When we just see numbers, we see numbers, and it is important and we care about numbers, but there tends to be a lack of urgency, right? Because there's a distance that's here in that, versus if we're able to actually begin to say, you know what, people, this data was drawn from people that are living in this particular community. This data was drawn from people that are living here, that we know. I have friends of mine, for example. I traveled at the end of August, through the beginning of September, to South Africa for a conference highlighting the remedies to, it's a world conference that Humphrey Institute puts on, highlighting the remedies to racial and social inequality around the world. Around the world. And so going to this space, one, there's so many of us that might, not only was I there for the conference, but I was there to spend time in Cape Town, which is where apartheid happened, which is where Nelson Mandela, which I talked about last week, was imprisoned. And for me to be able to go and to see in that space, I find some commonalities. I find that, in this injustice, not even beyond the color of my skin, to connect with people that have journeyed through challenges, I'm able to find some humanity here. I'm able to talk about what happened, not from a textbook, but from Tom Jones, who was our tour guide, who was imprisoned. Our tour guide was imprisoned with Mandela. And so now, right now, I have empathy, because it isn't just about a textbook I read, but it's faces, it's connection, it's relationship. And hearing this, I care about the matter even more because I'm there, because I'm engaged, because I see it. Right. And so I think it's important for us to this is why relationship is so important. Because we have to be able to connect with people and with their stories. White supremacy culture assumes that stories don't matter, that we're all the same. And so because we're all the same, then we experience the world the same, and we don't need that. But and if we take that stance, then we don't have this relationship, and the trust isn't built for me to be able to feel comfortable telling you about how I'm feeling or about where it's going. And the reason why that's important is because I would feel comfortable telling you if I feel comfortable that you will receive it in a particular way, that you will hold it in a particular way, that you will have empathy for my situation in a particular human, authentic way. So, modeling that relationship and teaching, here we are again, right? Where we are what we eat. So modeling that is really important to being able to teach students empathy. Modeling empathy is important to teach it. And we've got to be able to so we got to get outside of our walls of our classroom. We've got to get outside of these spaces and get into communities where we can actually connect with people and put faces to the data that we're seeing.
We've got one in the Q&A here for you. First, thank you for your advocacy. And confronting racism and race dynamics is challenging. What is one step one can take to incorporate and manage change in our lives and ministries?
You start with yourself, right? I mean, take an inventory of yourself. Take an inventory of who are you learning from? Where do you go to get your information? What are the demographics of the people that you are friends with on social media? Who are the circles? Where are you getting your news from? What are you listening to? Like, take inventory of the music that you're listening to, right? Take inventory of all of the avenues and contributing factors that make you who you are. take inventory of those and that influence your lens. I think that's one start. And being a student first is, might involve, going through that checklist. It might involve taking a real honest look at, the curriculum, what you're teaching, how you're teaching it. Take a real inventory about these things and consider, does your environment mirror your teaching? So does your environment, the people that you are friends with on social media, usually we are representatives of the circles that we navigate. So I would say the first thing would be to take inventory and build on that. And then starting with yourself. Starting with yourself first, and because remember, anti-racism embodied leads to anti-racism shared. So, we start there first. Yes, yes. Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. Yeah. It looks like I also see that someone shared that. That's a really powerful TED Talk as well. So thank you for sharing that. I've seen that several times. The danger of a single story is a really, really great TED Talk as well to be able to see. It's been highly viewed as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, this is our time.
This is our time. Gia, thank you so much for leading us through these conversations. We really are so appreciative of your time and your experience. Thank you all for being with us. I hope that this has been as informative and powerful for you as it has been for us. And I'm sure this isn't the last that we'll see of the Reverend Dr. Gia Brown. So thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.